Hi, I'm Lynn Cornell, and welcome back to Journey Through the Bible Verse by Verse. We're going to continue through our study of the Gospel of John, and we're in chapter 19. Now, we left off with the trial of Jesus. He had been flogged, and the flogging was Pilate's way of trying to appease the crowd. He was trying to say, look, this is an innocent man. That was a funny way, of course, of treating an innocent man. And by the way, and I'm unclear how the Jews would have been classified, because, meaning this, if they were Roman citizens, later we will know that Paul and many Jews did have dual citizenships. A Roman citizen could never have been treated this way. So it is interesting that Pilate would, if he thought that he was innocent, but apparently didn't either know or didn't take into consideration if whether or not Jesus was a Roman citizen. It's an interesting thought. And it's interesting that Pilate himself on 3 separate occasions said, I find no charge against this man, and yet still took him through the brutal process, the Roman process, as if he was a criminal. So now Pilate gave the order, the crucifixion order. They strapped the beam across, and now keep in mind, Jesus had also been flogged, so his back is ripped up, right, bleeding, and they then laid this cross. And we can imagine that the crosses did not go through wood classes. You know, if you remember in high school classes, you would have these shops, and one of the things I know I took them when I was a little boy, and you know, you would go through and learn how to cut wood, smooth it out. You know, you can cut 2x4, smooth it out. Go to any lumber store today, and 2x4s are cut square, but they're smooth. Well, they didn't do that with crosses. So imagine a rough cloth, a wood beam pressed against your back that's already bleeding and sore. It was, again, brutal, the crucifixion. And now they're parading him through, and there's people yelling at him, spitting on him. Verse 18, and verse 17 again, carrying his own cross, he went out to what is called Skull Place, which is Hebrew called Golgotha. There they crucified him, verse 18, there they crucified him and 2 other with him, one on either side with Jesus in the middle. So you have both of them, one they identified as thieves, by the way. Verse 19, Pilate also had a sign letter put on the cross. The inscription read, Jesus the Nazarite, King of the Jews. Now, this sign was really supposed to list their charges, which is kind of interesting, because if you was reading that, you would say, okay, this man is being crucified. And remember, crucifixion, you had to have done something really horrible. And so the charge is that he's the King of the Jews. Verse 20, many of the Jews read the sign because the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city. It was written in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek. So the chief priests of the Jews said to Pilate, don't write the King of the Jews, but that he said, I am the King of the Jews. Pilate replied, what I have written, I have written. So again, they tried to, even smear him. Now you can imagine the Pharisees are feeling themselves right now, by the way. They're feeling, we've accomplished something here. But it's very interesting that what you would see, that was his charge, by the way, that he was the King of the Jews. And even if the Pharisees had said that he said, I'm the King of the Jews, it still would have been a pretty pitiful charge for him to be hanging on the cross. And when the soldiers crucified him, they took his clothes and divided them into 4 parts, a part for each soldier. They also took his tunic, which was seamless, woven from one piece from the top. So they said one to another, let's not tear it, but cast lots for it to see who will get it. They did this to fulfill the scripture that says, they divided my clothes among them, and they cast lots for my clothing. And this is what the soldiers did. So they would take, now by the way, when they would crucify him, by the way, they would they would nail, of course, him. And by the way, they would nail Jesus like here in what we would call the wrist, but this was also according to the Jews, was called considered the hand. And again, hanging on a cross was a very excruciating way to die. You had to labor to breathe, and besides having spikes in your hand. And so the soldiers, in fulfillment to prophecy prophesied this, that they would cast lots, or we would say gamble, shoot dice, but it wasn't dice. Like I said, usually it was kind of sticks. You would have several sticks, so longer sticks, and then one shorter stick, and the one who drew the shorter stick wins. Okay, verse 25, standing by the cross of Jesus was his mother and his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas. Now, Mary was a common name. So this is why you see many Marys. And then Mary Magdalene. So 3 Marys that were sitting there. It's kind of the first time we see Jesus' aunt in the picture, or Mary's sister. Mary Magdalene is the first time we read about her, that John mentions her in the gospel. But of course, we will see her in the other gospels. Verse 26, when Jesus saw his mother and the disciple he loved standing there, he said to his mother, "Woman, here is your son." Then he said to the disciple, "Here is your mother." And from that hour, that disciple took her into his home. After this, when Jesus knew that everything was now accomplished and that the scriptures might be fulfilled, he said, "I am thirsty." Now, I want to say a quick word about what had just transpired. Jesus, one, being the firstborn, meaning he was the head of the family. Of course, Jesus himself, of course, not only being God manifested in the flesh, but just in terms of his earthly life, he being the oldest, he would be the head of the family. And what's interesting, so he commissions the care of his mother to John. And remember, Jesus had at least 4 brothers. And the last time we saw his brothers, they were mocking, they were taunting him. So no doubt, it's interesting that instead of committing the care of their mother to them, which is interesting in and of itself, we just don't have a lot of information as to why he did that. But Jesus, of course, felt that Mary's care, and Mary, remember, is kind of probably in her 50s at this time. It's possible she could be a little older, or let's say around 50s. But anyway, he commits the care of his mother to John, and then John takes her in and cares for her. Interesting. All right, verse 29. A jar full of sour wine was sitting there, so they fixed a sponge full of sour wine and hyssop and held it to his mouth. When Jesus had received the sour wine, he said, "It is finished." Then bowing his head, he gave up his spirit. Since it was the preparation day, the Jews did not want the bodies to remain on the cross on the Sabbath, for the Sabbath was the special day. So this was not only was it an average Sabbath or a Passover Sabbath, but it was a high holy day. So they sort of wanted to hurry up and get things, going so they can get into festival mode. They requested that Pilate have the men's legs broken and that their bodies be taken away. In other words, they wanted to kind of expedite the crucifixion. So if you was on the cross, you was holding up there and you was laboring to breathe and all that, even though your legs were nailed to the cross, you still could support your body. So by breaking the legs, you would then, you would be resting on your arms and you would suffocate. You wouldn't have any support for your upper body. Again, instead of saying, let's just stab them, it was more of another torturous death. You would then suffocate because you would now be like, you would be suffocating. So the soldiers came, verse 32, and broke the legs of the first man and the other who had been crucified with him. And when it came to Jesus, they did not break his legs, since they saw that he was already dead. But the one soldier pierced his side with the spear, and at once blood and water came out. And he who has testified, so that you all, he who saw this has testified, so that you also may believe. And his testimony is true, and he is telling the truth. Now, couple of things. One, this was a legal proceeding, by the way. Okay, if you ever watch a crucifixion, on how crucifixions go, I should say, every single thing is done in accordance to a legal proceeding. And so really even here it's the same. There's a legality here. They just couldn't say, well, we thought he was dead. So what they did was they would verify that he was dead. Well, when they broke his legs, when they broke the other two legs, they're suffocating, and eventually you would see them expire, give their last breath, right? Well, how would you know, since they would see Jesus, that it appeared that Jesus was already dead, so they pierced his side. And again, that was a legal way to be able to pronounce his death. And of course, water and blood came out, and that happens at the time of death. Your body and your organs are failing, and there's a whole medical term for that, medical reason for that. And thus, this was a legal verification that Jesus was indeed dead, thus fulfilling also a prophecy that his legs wouldn't be broken, which is very interesting. Now, John also tells us something. He throws something in here now and says that this is also a testimony to the fact that he's saying this that you may believe. That the testimony, the testimony here is for the purpose of verification. This is to testify, but also to show so that you can have a foundation for your belief. And that's interesting. Okay. Verse 36, for these things happen so that the scripture may be fulfilled, not a bone will be broken. Also, other scripture says they will look on him, they will look at the one they pierced. After this, Joseph of Arimathea went to, verse 38, let me read that again. After this, Joseph of Arimathea, who was a disciple of Jesus, but secretly because of fear of the Jews, and we read that, remember in chapter 12, where many of the Jews were secret disciples. But they were now, this was an act of boldness, by the way. So he said, ask Pilate that he might remove Jesus' body. Pilate gave him permission. So he came and took away his body. Nicodemus, who previously came to him at night, also came bringing a mixture of 75 pounds of myrrh and aloe. So now Nicodemus with Joseph, boldly now in the sense of proclaiming their faith. This is an act boldly of faith, which is, again, is kind of wonderful to see. You could judge whether or not if it was late or not. Verse 40, then they took Jesus' body and wrapped it in linen clothes with the aromatic spices, according to the burial custom of the Jews. And there was a garden in the place where he was crucified, a new tomb within the garden. No one had yet been placed in it. They placed Jesus there because of the Jewish preparation, and since the tomb was nearby. And again, this was also a prophecy that he would be buried in a rich man's tomb. So we see this, by the way, the disciples sort of are scattered. You know, if they're watching, they're kind of watching from afar. Mary Magdalene, and we're going to see more about her in the other gospel. She was one of Jesus' most faithful disciples. He had cast 7 demons out of her. Now she's here at this point. And even though the Sabbath day is the Sabbath day of rest, they will not rest. Again, as I said, this is a traumatic event that has happened. It has shook their very, very core. All right, so we're going to pick this up in chapter 20 next time. So I'll see you in chapter 20.